Alright, so here we are back in the studio. And you know, I make a lot of clips, and I don't always use all of them or publish all of them. And you know, I don't know if anybody cares someday when I'm dead, if any of my work ever amounts to anything in the world. Maybe somebody will unearth them and find them, and everybody will be like, oh, this is the woman who made this artwork. Oh, good thing she's dead. We'll say, oh, what a horrible woman she is. Probably. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But I've been doing reflection and stuff on my work that I recently finished, because I finished a couple pretty major projects in the past like month and a half. This series of paintings and my photography book. And you know, in this time I've also been doing some reading, and I read a lot of different things, and I watch a lot of documentaries, and I watch a lot of things I think some people might think is crap, but it all serves a purpose, you know. Like, sometimes I watch things that are just inane to be like, okay, humanity really needs help. Let's focus on the importance of the work that you're doing, even if nobody else gets it. Because, you know, if people are going, watching stuff like Judge Judy's, like, people going to court over this stuff and this kind of bullshit's going on in the world, and people need way more help, and I just can't even. But anyway, so I always do a little bit of research or reading or whatever on other artists when I'm working on things. And I picked this book up, I picked this book up down in Big Sur at a bookstore that's down there along the coast, a really good bookstore. And it's interesting. It's writings of Marcel Duchamp, and I was excited to pick it up for a couple reasons. Number one, because of the political climate of the world right now, in the political climate of the time of the world when Marcel Duchamp was making his work. And there's a lot of parallels in issue and issue and argument in some ways. And then also because I knew from, you know, my art history from back in the day in school that some of the things that I was concerned with or really mulling over in my own work were things that he focused on and was known for talking about, were important parts of his work. And so reading this book, it's interesting because it doesn't read like, this is not an easy reading book. This is, you know, the first part of the book, the very first part of the book, you know, the introduction is the person who compiled all of the writings, because these are from all these different places. You know, their take on what Marcel Duchamp was talking about. Now, as an artist myself, and looking at it through the lens of what I've been working on and what my process is, I would have focused on some different things in the introduction. You know, it's interesting to me. The first chapter of the book is basically, it looks like just notes probably taken out of his sketchbook. Now, it's not a photocopy of a page of his sketchbook, so it'd be interesting to me to see the orientation of these words on the page. You know, was he writing from top to bottom? Was he making notes around sketches? Because there's sometimes there's little like photocopies of images and things that are obviously taken directly from his sketchbook, right? He's talking a lot about, and this is specifically from Sketchbook, where he was working out issues or working out the design of Bride Strip Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, which was a really, you know, controversial piece when it was released because of his relationship with title to work and and other things that he was using in his work. You know, he's really well known for something called ready-mades, which was, you know, a lot of people at the time were like, oh, it's not art, it's not art, it's not art. But what he was talking about was context. And so he would take something like, the most famous one is the urinal, right? Everybody's, you know, Armut. That's what the piece is called, Armut. And this idea of taking something and looking at it specifically or exclusively as form, you know, on one hand, and on the other hand, looking at it, you know, in through the lens of context and where you're seeing it. So, you know, and then there were all these ideas around manufacture and his personal feelings about the art community, because we're coming out of the Impressionism movement, the Impressionist movement, which at the time itself was controversial. It's like, ooh, we're not doing classical painting anymore. But you know, before I get to that, reading his notes that are out of his sketchbook, it's interesting because his thought process, I can follow it. Like, I'm like, wow. Sometimes when I look at notes in sketchbooks that I've kept, because I now keep a book of lists of ideas, and I tend to do more studies. So like I did a series of studies, very small pieces, working up towards starting this process I'm doing that I call Deconstructed and Caustic. And those were like my sketchbook, you know, if I had them all still, which, you know, there were probably over 100 of those little pieces. I think I still have like maybe 15 of them. But if I had all of them and bound them together, you know, it would be my sketchbook from that time. And so I've been keeping sketchbook in a different way from what I had. So I have the sketch of these test images, and then I have my books of lists where I make lists and notes. And some of his notes seem very similar, because occasionally I'll write notes to myself like this. And even when it says, you know, it says marginal notes, and that's what all of these are. It's like he's talking about this is Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even. This is what he's working towards, and that's how this is annotated. This is out of the sketchbook leading up to this piece. And so, kind of subtitle, Delay in Glass. Use, quote, delay instead of picture or painting. Picture on glass becomes delay in glass, but delay in glass does not mean picture on glass. And so, you know, he's talking, that sounds like, oh, you know, what are you smoking, dude? And who knows, maybe he was smoking something, but, you know, what that sounds like to me is he's talking about an instance in time and points on a plane, and then it goes on a little bit further, and he actually starts talking about points in a plane and how a circle moves in a plane. So that is, in fact, what he was talking about. And so all of these other words, these language words, you know, bride and bachelor and things, these he's using that as a metaphor, those words as a metaphor for placement of points in a plane. And so, you know, thinking about what that piece looks like, you know, the big glass panel with all the sections and cross sections and things in it, it's like, okay, I see. He was looking at metaphysics. And so I didn't realize that, you know, until reading through this, and that became very, very interesting to me, especially since the last video I did about talking about my process with my work. You know, it's very much part of what I'm looking at. Like I've been quite interested in coming across this and learning about this a little bit more deeply, because he and I have a lot of very parallel thought patterning and direction. And he even gets into the point where he's talking about abstract and what that means. You know, I've been thinking about that a lot with my work too. It's like, you know, some people would right off the bat would call these abstract pieces, but they're not meant to be abstract at all. They're not abstractions of anything. They're a representation of something that I feel is very realistic, or something that I'm looking at that's very realistic. It's just an unknown, and so that's where the metaphysics come in. But, you know, it's interesting. Then there's like this whole section. So there's this, you know, the section with these little notes and these little pictures and stuff, and then there's this section that it reads like, you know, it's placed on the page like a poem, but again, it's just these notes, and it's like this is called Cast Shadows. And it probably has to do with, because that piece, Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, light falls through it and casts shadows, and that's the footprint of an artwork is as much a piece of the work as whatever it is that whatever is the physical, tangible body of the work. So all of these things, it's not just the piece, it's the shadow it casts. And so I think that's what this is about, cast shadows, probably to relate to the notes in the four-dimensional perspective. That's what they say. And I think that's definitely what it means. This is after the bride, make a picture of shadows cast. And I think what he's doing is making a to-do list for himself. Or, you know, or that's he's poetically talking about his to-do list, his thought process. By objects first on a plane, second on a surface of such or such curvature, third on several transparent surfaces, thus one can obtain a hypophysical analysis of the successive transformation of objects in their former outline. To do this, first determine the sources of light, gas, electricity, acetylene, for the differentiation of the colors, etc. Second, determine their number. Third, their situation with respect to their receiving planes. Obviously, the object will not be just any object. It shall have to be constructed sculpturally in 3 dimensions. The execution of the picture by means of luminous sources and by drawing the shadows on these planes, simply following the real outlines projected. All this to be completed and specially to relate with the subject. Isometric projections, see book. This for the upper part of the glass included between the horizon and the 9 holes. Cast shadows formed by the splashes coming from below, like some jets of water which weave forms in their transparency. That is, I must say something about me that makes sense to me, but it totally does. I mean, I understand exactly what he's talking about, you know, with this idea of transparency and layers and the footprint of a piece and the observation and the study that goes in and taking notes and going back and checking your notes and, oh my goodness, I'm going to make a picture. I'm going to draw a picture tracing the lines that are caused by the shadows cast by specific orientations of light. I mean, this is like performance art. It's not just an installation, you know, or it is an actual installation as opposed to just an exhibition, you know. I mean, installation artwork is a very specific kind of thing. It creates an environment, whereas a sculpture is exhibited in a room and has a footprint. An installation creates a room. So a sculpture, this is my definition, a sculpture has parameters and exists in a space. A sculpture exists in a space, whereas an installation creates the parameters and creates the space. And so this is what he's talking about. These are like tech notes, and he has it presented as a poem. I think that's really quite funny. And, you know, the rest of these notes are like that, and he's specifically, you know, these drawings about placement of line and light and dots and, you know, oh, Mr. Duchamp. So then he comes to the United States, and I just read this article, The Great Trouble with Art in This Country, and it's not a real long article, but it is a dense article. And in it, he talks about his process and about titling work, which is, you know, a very big part of the concept. You know, it's not just a name. You know, for him, you know, in some schools of painting, the title of paintings were merely labels. You know, like classical paintings. There's this beautiful portrait of Leonora of Toledo at the DIA. Beautiful painting, portrait, and, you know, portraits generally are, you know, just a title, and it's just the name of the painting. It's a label for the painting. Duchamp was taking titles of work and making them part of the work. So the title was more than just a label. It was an expression or a piece of the work, a component of the work itself. And in different movements of artwork, you know, people go back and forth about this, and you know, is it important, is it not important. You know, some people will call things untitled and then give it a number, untitled 1, untitled 2, untitled 3. And, you know, I think I may have had 1 or 2 pieces in my life when I was in school or whatever that I called untitled something. And I really think out of personal experience that it's a cop-out. And that's a horrible term, cop-out. But I think it's a cheat. I think it's a laziness. My opinion is that to name a piece untitled something or other, you know, untitled and then give it a number is laziness. But anyway, that's me. And I just this first paragraph: the great trouble with art in this country at present, and apparently in France also. He was from France, but he was writing from the United States. Is that there is no spirit of revolt. No new ideas appearing among the younger artists. They are following along the paths beaten out by their predecessors, trying to do better what their predecessors have already done. In art, there is no such thing as perfection, and a creative lull occurs always when artists of a period are satisfied to pick up a predecessor's work where he dropped it and attempt to continue what he was doing. When, on the other hand, you pick up something from an earlier period and adapt it to your own work, an approach can be very creative. The result is not new, but it is new in so much as it is a different approach. Art is produced by a succession of individuals expressing themselves. It is not a question of progress. Progress is merely an enormous pretension on our part. There was no progress, for example, in Corot over Phidias, and abstract or naturalistic is merely a fashionable form of talking today. It is no problem. An abstract painting may not look at all abstract in 50 years. And that's a really, really interesting and astute observation. And it's part of what I've been thinking about with my work, and how, if you don't know anything about it, that it just would appear to be abstract shapes on a field, and it's so much more than that. From my perspective, as the maker. And, he goes on to talk about this. This article was written from an interview with James Johnson Sweeney, The Bulletin of the Museum of Modern Art, volume 13, number 4 through 5, 1946, pages 19 to 21. 1946, really, really interesting time, right? We're talking about just post World War II. And or tail end World War II, post World War II. So this would have been him coming to the United States after the war, and then he's talking about showing with other artists from all over the world, not just Europe. Actually, he doesn't talk at all. Well, he talks about the Cubist movement, and the Cubist movement was largely a Western European movement. But then he's talking about also exhibiting at the same time. This movement is called Dadaism, and this is post-surrealism. Surrealism and abstract expressionism and impressionism were. It was Impressionism, and then abstract expressionism, surrealism, and Dadaism. These all kind of were on tail ends, coming out of pre-World War II, and into post-World War II. And the Futurism movement was based out of Russia. And what's very, very interesting to me is that he speaks nothing of nations or countries or politics other than to respond. I guess there was this question, what's the great trouble with art in this country? He says the great trouble with art in this country, talking about the United States, and apparently in France also. This is the only reference that he makes, and he makes the comparisons then to these other movements, but doesn't speak to any of those countries' politics or about what's going on in those countries. In Futurism, it's he's an interpretation. He talks about the piece that he did after the bride stripped by her bachelors, even called King and Queen. Painted shortly after Nude, which came after Bride Stripped Bare by her bachelor's even. But Futurism, no, it's important to talk about this. In the King and Queen, painted shortly after the Nude, there are no human forms or indications of anatomy, but in it one can see where the forms are placed, and for all this reduction, I would never call it an abstract painting. So, you know, I think what he's talking about there is about abstraction as being something, as having something that is totally non-related visually and using it to represent something else, an idea or a form, you know, other than what is actually there. So, you know, he was talking about taking the shapes, lines, shadows, and setting them in different planes based on the rotations of circles within those planes, or those dots within those planes. And so it might not look immediately realistic like a human form, but those shapes are coming out of an actual placement of points that are related. So that's what he's talking about there. So it's really interesting because, you know, this is what I was talking about as a, you know, abstract as opposed to non-representational, or abstract as right and representational. You know, interesting. So this is futurism was an impressionism of the mechanical world. I disagree with that because what they were trying with artists in Russia, I mean, artists in Russia were so oppressed at that time. You know, all fine artists were extremely oppressed, and there was great censorship in Russia, and strict demand for strict adherence to image, or some sort of like pretense, right? You know, thought was extremely restricted, and so I disagree with what he's saying. I think it's more than just being impressionism of the mechanical world. You know, they were trying to show movement, and that's what. So like, there'd be a painting, and it would look like a woman's legs were going in a circle or whatever, or like there was a fan, and it was like supposed to show movement in still time, and you know, I think that the desire to grasp at that movement had more to do with politics and the political climate of post World War II Russia moving forward after, you know, the great scorched earth policy. That's how the Russians drove Hitler out. You know, there was great annihilation that the Russian people did to their own infrastructure, just to make it unusable to Hitler, and that's how Hitler was defeated. And so there was a great need for rebuilding, and then, you know, the Iron Curtain went up, and so there was a cutoff from so much resource, both intellectual, you know, resource exchange, both intellectual and physical resource itself. And so, you know, I think the movement of futurism in painting was born more of communist oppression and frustration of people, and a desire of people to move forward and trying to capture that visually in some way that was expressive. It was kind of a desperate cry. So, you know, I disagree with him on that. I think he simplified it too much, but he was talking about how he wanted to, quote, get away from the physical aspect of painting and was much more interested in creating ideas in painting. He says, quote, "For me, the title was very important. I was interested in making painting serve my purpose and in getting away from the physicality of painting. I was interested in ideas, not merely the visual products." And, you know, he's talking about not setting out to make a pretty scene or a pretty painting. And that had been highly prized for so long. In Renaissance, classical, neoclassical, Baroque, you know, you go through all of these movements and Golden Age movements, right? And they were all very much focused on something being pretty, on aesthetic beauty, and surrealism and impressionism, surrealism, futurism, Dadaism. They were all looking at something else entirely different. And to think about what was going on in the crafts movements at that time, you know, that would have been at the same time as like the Bauhaus movement and the rise of utilitarianism, or the resurgence of utilitarianism, which up until, you know, years before that had been, utilitarianism would never have been a movement, because craftspeople you made something beautiful, and it had to work because people needed to make things by hand in order to have things to, You know, you had to make your, you had to go to the silversmith to get your flatware. You know, each person might have their own knife. You'd have your own place setting, and it took time, and somebody made that. You paid somebody to make that for you, as opposed to just going in and buying a service, right? That was something that was reserved for the very, very wealthy to own a service, an entire service. You know, the regular person would just have their knife, right? Knife and maybe a spoon, and that's what people had, and you carried it with you. So he's talking about getting away from the physicality of painting, and he's talking about an abstraction of idea and process altogether. And I understand, you know, for me, it's more about detachment from the physicality of the painting, and that can be problematic. I find that to be problematic personally, because the detachment from the physicality of the painting is what leaves me susceptible to allowing myself to compromise myself more physically in the process itself. I wouldn't be able to make the work if I weren't able to do that detachment, so it needs to exist. And so it's interesting to think about it as getting away from the physicality of painting. Because for me, it's not about running away from it, getting away from it. It's about sustaining it or enduring the physicality of painting. He says, then he talks about how his paintings, he wanted to put painting once again at the service of the mind, which I don't know, when he says once again, from what time period. It's like, from what I would have liked to have known a little more about that. If I had been the person interviewing him, I would have asked. I don't know, this isn't the whole interview, or so this is just an excerpt, so maybe if I read the whole thing, who knows how long that is. But his paintings were, of course, at once regarded as intellectual literary painting. That sounds snobby, I don't know. But I understand the idea of intellectual painting. I definitely feel like my paintings are intellectual, so maybe I'm snobby. It says, until the last 100 years, all painting had been literary or religious, and that's true. So you know, this was a time period where, you know, the church was no longer the biggest patron of the arts, and so of course, you know, they're going to be people are going to be wanting to look at different ideas. And you know, even though maybe they weren't religious, I believe all painting to be spiritual, to be an expression of the human spirit, therefore be spiritual, whether or not you have an active, engaged kind of relationship with spirit outside of the self, you know, or not. I believe all painting to be spiritual. And he says, the more sensual appeal a painting provided, the more animal it became, the more highly it was regarded. And so he's talking about pulling away from classical technique, I think. Never comes right out and says that about technique, you know, because there were nudes and things in all of these other paintings. But, you know, I think what he's talking about is direct application and use of material. So there was that was a big criticism that, you know, neoclassical and classical painters had, people who worked in those styles had against people who were working in more abstracted forms. That was like a big deal. It's like, oh my goodness, you're rejecting the salon, you're rejecting the format, you're rejecting these critical techniques. And you know, there were other things that were happening at the time, like production of paints were becoming industrialized, and part of this was because of wars that had been fought and things that were being traded and access to materials. And so, you know, an automation and being able to put things in tubes as opposed to having to mix your oil paint exactly right then from, you know, your ground pigment to your medium, your oil medium. That whole process, you know, at one time would have happened when the artist sat down to paint, because there were no tubes. You didn't have tubes of paint, right? So, you know, part of that automation allowed for the stretching of the medium and the exploration of the medium in ways that may have been considered frivolous or wasteful before that. I don't know. Dada was an extreme protest against the physical sides of painting. It was a metaphysical attitude. It was a sort of nihilism. Well, I'll have to take his word on that. For me, painting isn't nihilistic, although I do acknowledge that there is some physical cost to myself, to the self here. It was a way to get out of a state of mind, to avoid being influenced by one's immediate environment or by the past, to get away from cliches, to get free. See, for me, that happens when I'm painting, but you know, when I'm in the actual act of doing these works, but that's not why I'm doing the work. So it's a different point of departure for me than what he was doing. But he goes on to talk about, you know, philosophical outlook and what he's learned from the other movements that were happening parallel, particularly Cubism. He says Cubism gave him many ideas for decomposing forms, and you know, it's like I said on the back of this book, you know, the human form has served as inspiration to artists as long as artists have made art. Nothing in art is truly new. Artists explore the same themes over and over. The only thing that changes is the year and context of history. And so, you know, artists are always looking at the decomposition of things. You know, this deconstructed and caustic that I'm doing. This is a look at decomposition of a classical form. So, you know, I'm not doing anything new other than I'm looking through my lens at something. But the idea itself, you know, this pursuit is always the pursuit of the artist. And it's very interesting to me. And he's talking about these things. And then he makes this comment, I felt that as a painter, it was much better to be influenced by a writer than by another painter. I can understand where he's coming from on that, but I still like looking at other artists' work, but I look at many different types of artwork, you know, so I did this photo book where these pieces are based on they're photo pieces based on sculptures and or paintings, you know, like here you see a photo based on that sculpture. It's a Rodin, right? And he talks about Rodin in here specifically. He talks about Rodin's work.